today's mindful moment. Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. This time, we're taking on Reconstruction. You know, that era after the Civil War always seems to get simplified, right?
It definitely gets oversimplified.
But we're going to try to untangle it. We've got Eric Foner's book, Reconstruction, America's Unfinished Revolution, as our guide.
Great choice. It's a classic.
I think everyone's heard that saying, Reconstruction failed. But I don't know, what if that's not the whole picture?
That's exactly what Foner argues. He really pushes back against that simple narrative.
So, where do we even begin with this?
Well, Foner says, Reconstruction didn't just start after the war. It actually started during it.
Oh, interesting. So it's not just about, the political stuff happening after the fighting stopped.
Exactly. He talks about how enslaved people were already taking steps toward their own freedom, even before the Emancipation Proclamation.
That's right. He has that story about the black man in Georgia who said he'd been looking for the angel of the Lord since he was a kid.
Powerful image, right? Shows that the desire for freedom was always there, even when the path wasn't clear.
So the Emancipation Proclamation wasn't just some random event. It was part of this larger struggle.
Exactly. And it gets even more interesting when you consider that the South wasn't this totally unified place.
Oh, you mean not everyone was on board with the Confederacy?
There were deep divisions, especially between classes. You had the wealthy planters who wanted to protect their way of life, which, depended on slavery.
Right, of course.
But then you had these poorer white farmers. A lot of them didn't even own slaves.
So they weren't really fighting for the same thing.
Not at all. Foner uses these primary sources, like letters and diaries, to show how much resentment these farmers felt towards the planters.
Makes you wonder how united the Confederacy really was.
Right. It totally changes how we usually think about the Confederate South.
It definitely wasn't just black and white.
Exactly. So the war ends, slavery is abolished. You would think, freedom, right, everything's good.
Yeah, you'd think it would be that simple.
But Foner paints a much more complicated picture. Yeah, there was joy, of course, but also a lot of confusion and danger for black people.
What do you mean?
Well, he talks about this former slave, Henry Adams, decided to test his freedom by leaving his plantation without a pass, something he could never have done before.
Bold move. What happened?
He was confronted by a group of white men, beaten, and questioned about his supposed owner.
Wow.
It's a reminder that just because slavery was over on paper didn't mean the reality on the ground had changed that quickly.
So freedom wasn't so straightforward.
Not at all. But even with all these dangers, black communities started building their own institutions, churches, schools, you name it.
That's incredible, that resilience.
It really is. And that's where the political battle over Reconstruction really heats up. You've got Lincoln and Johnson, his successor, with their vision for rebuilding the nation. And then you've got these radical Republicans in Congress with a totally different idea.
So a real clash of ideologies.
Absolutely. Lincoln and Johnson wanted a quicker, more lenient approach to bring the South back into the fold. Not so much focus on protecting black rights.
And the radical Republicans.
They had a much more radical vision. They wanted to see real change. Black citizenship, equality, the whole 9 yards.
So how'd that play out?
Well, one example is the Freedmen's Bureau. It was this organization created by Congress to help former slaves transition to freedom, education, legal aid, even land redistribution.
So there was a chance for black economic independence.
That was the hope. But Johnson, he wasn't really on board with that. He was more sympathetic to the former slave owners. He undermined the Bureau's efforts.
How so?
He issued all these pardons that let those former Confederates get their land back, even the land that was supposed to go to freedmen.
So that dream of 40 acres and a mule, gone.
Pretty much. Politics and resistance to black empowerment won out. And this fight over the direction of Reconstruction, well, it set the stage for even more conflict and struggle. And so you have all this tension, all this struggle, and then comes the Reconstruction Act of 1867.
Okay, so tell me about that.
It completely changes things up. Johnson's lenient approach, out the window. The South gets divided up into military districts.
Whoa, military districts.
Yeah, the Army's in charge now. They have to oversee the creation of new state governments in the South.
So the federal government's getting really involved now.
Big time. And these new governments, get this, they have to let black men vote.
That's huge.
It was a radical change for sure. Didn't go over well with everyone, naturally.
I can imagine. So how did these new Reconstruction governments actually work out?
Surprisingly, they did a lot. Public schools for the first time in the South, they expanded social welfare programs, reformed the legal system, the whole thing.
So real progress toward equality.
Yeah, I mean, it was a mixed bag, for sure, but progress was definitely happening. And this is where the story gets, well, twisted. You start hearing about these carpetbaggers and scalawags.
Right. I always wondered about those terms.
Totally loaded language, right?
Yeah.
Designed to make Reconstruction look bad. Like, carpetbaggers, they were supposedly these greedy Northerners coming to exploit the South.
Like vultures.
Exactly. But Foner, he digs deeper, shows that many of them were actually Union veterans wanting to help rebuild, or just idealists who believed in a better future for the South.
Makes sense. And the scalawags.
Basically, Southerners who sided with the Republicans.
Why would they do that?
Some wanted economic progress, some truly believed in racial equality. It wasn't a huge group, but it shows how complex Southern politics really were at that time.
It wasn't just a simple north-south divide then.
Nope. And one of the most amazing things about this period, to me at least, is that you see this rise of Black political power, like actual Black leadership.
Wow. So from being denied basic rights to having a say in government.
Yeah, and these leaders weren't just figureheads. They were fighting for things like land reform, education, protection from violence. They had a real impact, at least for a while.
For a while, though. Why didn't it last?
A bunch of reasons. They were often outnumbered, they faced tons of racist violence, and just lacked resources. It was an uphill battle.
Plus, you still had the massive economic problems in the South, right?
Absolutely. The economy was a mess, still so dependent on cotton, no money, really. And that fight for land ownership, it just wouldn't go away.
So economic struggles on top of everything else.
Yeah, and Foner argues that those economic issues made dealing with racial inequality even harder. Like, he brings up this example of railroad development, all this focus on boosting the economy, but it kind of overshadowed any efforts to actually help Black communities.
So short-term gains over long-term solutions.
Pretty much. And as things get worse economically, you see this backlash against Reconstruction get even stronger. The Ku Klux Klan shows up and all these other white supremacist groups. Violence and intimidation become the norm.
Not just random acts, though, right? This was organized, targeted terror.
Exactly. Foner talks about the brutality of the Klan. The murders, the whippings, the threats, all aimed at stopping Black people from voting, from having any power.
Trying to take back control and the government.
They tried to fight the Klan, but it was never enough. And as Northern support for Reconstruction faded, things just got bleaker.
So you've got the South struggling economically, the Klan on the rise, and no one up north really cares anymore. Where does that leave us?
Well, it all leads up to this thing called the Compromise of 1877. Basically a backroom deal that pretty much killed Reconstruction for good.
A compromise. Sounds shady.
It was. The presidential election in 1876 between Hayes and Tilden, total mess. No one knew who won.
Oh, wow. A real constitutional crisis then.
You got it. To avoid a total meltdown, they struck this deal. Hayes, the Republican, becomes president, but in return, federal troops leave the South.
So, no more protection.
Exactly. And with the troops gone, Reconstruction was over. Southern Democrats took over and basically reversed everything that had been accomplished.
So it all just falls apart. After all that struggle, after all that hope, what's the point of it all then? If it just ends like this?
Yeah, it's tough. Definitely makes you wonder. I mean, Foner, he wrestles with this too. Reconstruction definitely didn't achieve everything it set out to do. Racial equality, still a long way off. The South's economy, still a mess. And the dream of a real multiracial democracy, well, it was crushed.
But there had to be some good that came out of it, right? Some lasting impact.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we can't ignore the achievements of Reconstruction. Even if they were incomplete, they were still significant. Think about it. For the first time in American history, Black people in the South had a real voice in government. They held office, they made laws, they fought for their communities. That's huge.
Yeah, it's hard to overstate how revolutionary that was.
Right. And even though those gains were eventually lost, they left a mark. Like, Foner argues that the Civil Rights Movement, 100 years later, that movement had its roots in Reconstruction.
Interesting. So how so?
Well, think about the 14th and 15th Amendments. They came out of Reconstruction, and they guaranteed citizenship and voting rights for Black men. Those amendments became the legal foundation for the fight against segregation and discrimination in the 20th century.
So even though Reconstruction failed in the short term, it planted the seeds for future change.
Exactly. And the memory of Reconstruction, the memory of a time when Black people had power, that memory kept the hope alive. It inspired future generations to keep fighting.
Like a flame that was extinguished but left some embers burning.
Perfect analogy. And that's really what Foner wants us to think about, the unfinished business of Reconstruction. Like, how does this history connect to our own time? How do we deal with the legacy of racism and inequality that we inherited from this period?
Big questions. And not easy answers. I mean, we're still dealing with these issues today, aren't we? Racial justice, voting rights, economic disparities, it's all connected to this history.
Absolutely. This isn't just ancient history. It's about understanding who we are as a nation and where we need to go.
So anyone listening, if you want to really dig into this crucial period in American history, Eric Foner's Reconstruction, America's Unfinished Revolution, is a must-read. It's not always easy, but it's so important. It'll totally change how you think about Reconstruction and I think how you think about America today.
Couldn't agree more. Everyone should read this book.
And, of course, if you enjoyed this deep dive, be sure to subscribe to The Deep Dive for more explorations of, well, pretty much everything. History, science, culture, you name it. We love to challenge assumptions and get people thinking. And hey, if you like this episode, spread the word, share it with your friends, family, whoever. Let's keep the conversation going. Until next time, keep diving.